Well, good afternoon and welcome to Round the Table with Christian Concern. It's great to see you here. Today, we're going to talk about free speech because it's been in the news today. The government's appointed a free speech champion at universities. And I'm joined by two special guests. First of all, Roger Kiska from the Christian Legal Centre, who has done several legal cases around and about free speech. Hi, Roger. And secondly, by Emma Webb from the Free Speech Union, who is an expert on free speech issues around the country. Emma, thank you so much for joining us. Great to see you today.
Good to be with you.
So, Emma, I'm going to go to you first. Emma, so in the news today, and it was quite high-profile news, the government's appointed a free speech champion for universities. Tell us, why has the government done this and what difference is it going to make?
So, firstly, the reason why the government have done this, despite what critics might say that this is a made-up culture war-related issue, that they have made up the issue of a crisis of free speech on campuses in order to have something to fight against and to distract from other issues. The reality is that free speech on campuses has been in a serious crisis for actually a very long time. A policy exchange report from last August found discrimination and negative effects on free speech across the political spectrum, but particularly against conservative views. They found that it was a serious problem. It led to discrimination also in the hiring, promotion, the giving of grants and so on. So obviously, on top of that, there are all of the cases of no platforming and people losing their jobs. So free speech is something that is, quite clearly and demonstrably under threat. And that's why this is such a welcome move from the government to not only to put this free speech champion in post to deal with this and potentially to impose fines on universities who don't uphold free speech, but also they're suggesting a positive duty rather than the current situation is that under the Education Act, universities have to take reasonable measures to protect free speech. But what the government is suggesting now is that they should have a positive duty to promote free speech as well. And this would also encompass the student unions, who are usually the people who are behind cancellations, no platforming, which the student unions are currently under the Charity Commission. And so under this new free speech champion, it would roll everything into one based at the Office for Students. And it would also potentially, they're discussing legislation to allow people to, this duty would allow people to sue their employers, sue the universities, students potentially as well, if they felt that their right to free speech had been violated in a similar way to the way that you might be able to sue under the Equality Act. So there are a whole package of new tools that the government are proposing here to deal with this huge crisis, and effectively to try and rebalance our educational institutions so that people feel that they can have academic free inquiry without the fear of reprisals or a fear that their career will be torpedoed if they speak out.
Wow, sounds like make a big difference there. And if you're watching live, by the way, on Facebook or YouTube, do put in some comments or questions, and we'll try and get to them as we move up with the discussion. But Roger, I noticed that in the government report, Felixs was actually mentioned by the Minister of State. And he's one of our key cases that actually has contributed to provoking change here from the government. Why don't you remind us about Felix's case, Roger, and why it was so important in this?
Sure. And before I do, I'll just say that this is an area that we've seen firsthand. Now, there's been several excellent studies evidencing the cancel culture and the suppression of speech on campuses over the last few years. But in our work at CLC, we've seen it firsthand. The number of cases we receive, the inquiries we receive from university students, professors, and others involved in university life has grown exponentially over the last 3-4 years. So we've seen it firsthand. Now, our supporters might not know about that because we don't publicize the vast majority of them, which just speaks to how vicious the disciplinary proceedings in universities can be. Felixs was a case that we publicized. He was a master's in social work student, had never discriminated against a service user. There was never a claim that he had discriminated against a service user, and there was no indication that he ever would. In a private Facebook message, he mentioned the biblical position on homosexual behavior. That debate was about same-sex marriage, and it was an appropriate, for that forum, it was an appropriate comment. An anonymous complaint, and in all of these cases, there are always anonymous complaints, was brought to the University of Sheffield. And as a result, he was removed from the course, saying that because he expressed his views in the manner he did, he wasn't fit to be a social worker. That made its way all the way up to the Court of Appeal. And I believe it's a landmark ruling. And the fact that it's in this report as evidence that a free speech champion is needed proves it to be. And that judgment said that holding a view, expressing a view, Christian or otherwise, was wholly different from discrimination. And universities seem to forget that. They think that merely holding a view that they don't agree with is somehow discriminatory and against the Equality Act. So, you know, it's a case we're real proud of. We fought it for numerous years. Felixs himself has been a champion for free speech and his beliefs, and you know, it's paid off.
And what difference, if we had the free speech champion in place when Felix's case had come up, what difference would it have made, Roger, do you think?
Well, he could have certainly sued for damages. He was, you know, this case has gone on for several years, so he's been removed from the workforce for a number of years. So one of the provisions would be that an individual student can sue for the damages caused by their expulsion from university. So it would make a difference. I would say that the Human Rights Act already has provisions, statutory provision, which allows you to sue a university campus. And there's also a public sector equality duty owned by universities, which you can also bring a claim under. So this isn't unique in that it's the first time we can sue universities. We've done it before, but it certainly adds a lot of teeth to existing legislation, which we're happy about.
Wow. And Emma, why do you think the culture's gone this way of thinking it's appropriate at universities of all places to sort of restrict discussion and say you can't have these kind of discussions? How have we got to this place, do you think?
Well, I think what Roger already sort of alluded to there is that the Equality Act and particularly people's, should we say, ideological views about equality makes universities particularly sensitive to anything that they perceive as potentially causing offence. So one of the first people that the FSU went to bat for was Professor Selina Todd, who was an academic at she was banned from
FSU is Free Speech Union, for those who don't
so the Free Speech Union supported Professor Selina Todd after she was banned from, or no platform, so the invitation was withdrawn from her speaking at an event at Oxford University on the subject of women's liberation, because she had done some work with a charity that wanted to was campaigning to protect same-sex spaces, and I think this was one of the reasons why they felt that it wasn't right for her to speak at this women's liberation event. And a lot of this obviously comes from the pervasive culture within universities where a particular, perhaps we should say, particular political line is more common within higher education settings. So there are a disproportionate number of left-wing people are represented, and so this obviously skews things slightly in favour of some views that can be expressed and others that are viewed as less favourable. So I think it's a complicated issue, but the policy exchange report that I mentioned already from August last year had found some pretty shocking statistics suggesting that a worryingly high number of people, academics, wouldn't want to be seen sitting next to at lunch anybody that was a known Leave voter or had expressed gender critical
next to them at lunch. Wouldn't want to be sitting next to them. What?
Yeah, it was something like 50 odd percent of academics that were surveyed said that they wouldn't feel comfortable. I hope that statistic is correct, but a worryingly large amount of people said that they didn't want to be seen sitting next to people with these taboo views at lunch. So and it affects people in promotion and in the giving of grants.
Wouldn't want to be seen, and that's kind of extraordinary.
Yeah, so I think there's just generally, and this is not only the case in universities, of course. Universities are always a kind of exaggerated example of society at large. The Reclaim Party's polling that came out last week suggested that more than half of people in the country didn't feel that they were free to express their views in comparison to 5 years ago.
Wow.
And particularly on issues to do with, for example, immigration. And I think there is just a general climate of the chilling on free speech. And one good example of this is a recent example is what was going on at Somerville College in Oxford.
Well, yeah.
With the unconscious bias training. It seems to have become a sort of unquestioning shift towards the chilling of free speech. So in response to the Free Speech Union's letter that was sent to the principal of this college, objecting to students being made to do mandatory unconscious bias training and to get 100%, the principal then confirmed that there weren't going to be any disciplinary measures if the students didn't get 100%, but that they might be invited for a chat. And the Harry Miller case, actually, the judge's comments on the Harry Miller case suggested and recognised that that chat that they would have with students, just as the chat that they had with Harry Miller after his tweets when the police officer said that he should check his thinking. That has an enormous effect on people's free speech. If they feel that students or academics feel that they see their colleagues being cancelled or no platformed, they're made to take free unconscious bias training and invited for a chat if they don't give the right answers, even if those answers go against their conscience. It's a broader crisis, I think, of freedom of speech, freedom of conscience. And when it comes to the Equality Act protecting people expressing philosophical beliefs, those beliefs are often described as not being sort of fit to be held in a democratic society. And so I think that is a reason why these new measures, that these new, tools in the toolkit, as it were, are going to go a long way to trying to address that imbalance that has sort of almost naturally arisen in the universities just because of the disproportionate representation of people holding particular political views.
Yeah, and it's not just politics; it's also ethics, isn't it? Because transgenderism and abortion are hot topics here. That people try and silence you if you're on the wrong side of it, or if actually, I should say, on the right side of it, really. Roger, one of our cases that's been in the news this week as well in relation to this is an academic freedom case, isn't it? It's James Caspian, who wanted to research detransitioning people. Talk us through that one, Roger.
Yeah, sure. I mean, just a note on unconscious bias. That idea has been around for a long time, since at least 19th century German philosophy. People like Kant and Schopenhauer, at least they were intellectually honest enough to say that bias crosses political spectrums and isn't a one-way street. But I mean, the Caspian case is fascinating because James is far from being a conservative. He is someone who's been a frontline worker in this area, gender reassignment psychology, for a decade. And he saw firsthand that the demographic of people who were coming was changing rapidly, and the number of people who were coming was changing rapidly, and the number of people regretting their transition was growing exponentially. Discussing it with a colleague who was very preeminent and who did the surgeries himself, who said there is a problem here, and there's no academic literature on this. No one studied it. That was the impetus for James to go back to university and do a graduate level course, specifically on this research area. So we've got a guy who is very serious, 10 years experience on the front line doing this. So, in an area that's much needed. He puts his research proposal forward. It's initially accepted until the university, BASPA, thinks that, this is actually could be a politically incorrect topic. More than that, we can get, and they use that in their correspondence to James, like, this is politically incorrect, despite the fact that this is real and that people are suffering from remorse and that it hasn't been studied. But they go on and say, we could get, as a university, negative publicity from transgender activists who have a vested interest in seeing this research not move forward. And on those grounds, they rejected his research proposal. So it's really, the worst as far as academic freedom.
They said you can't research this because it's politically incorrect and people might not like it. Will the free speech champion make a difference to that?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say if his remit is anything, it should be that, as well as no platforming, the ability of students to use their social media. They're adults; they should be able to use their social media the way they want to. So I think it would help. We've recently filed. It was just in December that we filed the case to the European Court of Human Rights for James. So the highest human rights court in Europe is now going to be reviewing this case.
And I think as well, if we didn't have if we didn't have a situation where he had to go to the European courts and international law for this, because the domestic tools had been exhausted. This is another reason why it's a really good news that we're going to have more robust protections here, because he would have the ability potentially to sue. And I think that will force universities to more actively protect free speech, because at the moment, under the Education Act, though they have a duty to protect free speech, it doesn't seem to be actually dealing with the enormous, the Free Speech Union deals with case after case after case of people who are suffering discrimination in this way. And it shouldn't be the case that somebody has to go to resort to international law in order to have their situation redressed in this way. It should be something that we should be able to deal with domestically. I think it's actually it should be seen as a great shame on our country and domestic law that he would even have to do that in the first place. So that's another reason why I think this is so welcome.
Yeah, no, it's shocking that that the university would consider it's okay to say, no, you can't research that because it's politically incorrect. Extraordinary, really. I noticed that Bruce Bennett has made some comments here on Facebook. If you're watching live, do make comments and stuff. Bruce Bennett said, education institutions, both higher and lower, have been indoctrinating young people in cultural Marxism, and any opponents are fundamentally evil. I mean, that's what they're teaching. I think that's what he means. How do you see this embedded attitude being reversed? I mean, maybe, Emma, is that one for you? I don't know. Do you want to answer that one?
Yeah, I think... Sorry.
Go on. I thought probably you need to explain what cultural Marxism is a little bit, if you can.
Yeah, so cultural Marxism is a term that has become quite maligned, actually. But what it's usually used to refer to is what you might say is applied critical theory, which is a kind of mishmash of. I think James Lindsay and Helen Pluckrose describe it as normative or applied postmodernism, which it's a very complicated philosophical thing to explain now, but essentially the argument would be that cultural Marxism, or dividing the the into
victims and oppressors, isn't it?
Victims and oppressors on the basis
Marxism,
of culture.
That was economic, and then in cultural Marxism, it's about cultural issues like LGBT, victims and oppressors, or race, victims.
Yeah, and
everyone
I think
is either a victim or an oppressor. That's the point, isn't it?
Yeah, and within the university context, this is obviously, it was born in the universities. It's often traced back to the Frankfurt School, and has been particularly dominant within universities through critical theory, social justice activism, critical race theory, amongst all sorts of other things. It's where fat phobia comes from, Islamophobia. All of these terms are linked to these methodologies that universities apply and are sort of semi-saturated with. So yeah, in some ways, that is one of the reasons perhaps why free speech is threatened at universities, because anybody who falls foul of this particular ideology tends to be no platformed. So I think one of the ways, and this doesn't just go for ideological reasons why people may be cancelled, though obviously that is the reason why people do get cancelled, but dealing with free speech threats on campus generally, and rolling back the influence of those who think that silencing free speech is acceptable and justified, particularly on the basis of their own political views, trying to silence people who disagree with them or who would like to have a discussion about ideas that have become taboo in their opinion. Yeah. The weight of the law making universities, forcing universities to be in a position where they have to uphold neutrality and put a fence around people's free intellectual inquiry. I think that it's not about reversing, as they say, the long march through the institutions. It's about giving people the opportunity to seek justice when their free speech is discriminated against and stopped, and to create costs for those who would try to trample all over other people's right to academic freedom or freedom of expression.
Yeah. And Roger, one of the other issues that gets silenced is the issue of abortion, isn't it? And I know you've been helping a number of pro-life organizations at universities, and some of these have been in the news, but some of them we've done, like you say, without telling people. I know you were doing one just a couple of weeks ago, weren't you?
Literally now, doing one now. I was working on it today.
Right. So tell us about how this works. What happens then with these pro-life organizations, Roger?
Well, they're some of my favorite cases because frankly, they're so easy to win. The student unions act so egregiously and so counter to the law that they're just a few letters, maybe a court filing, and they're done. But one of the new remits for the free speech champion will extend the ability to protect speech to student unions, who are some of the worst offenders. And so across the country, so in Northern Ireland, in Scotland, and in England, we've seen student unions put up policies which are so-called pro-choice policies, which A, tend to no platform pro-life organizations, B, tend to control what they can put out on social media or how they can advocate their pro-life views on campus, C, the language they use, and D, their freedom of association, even their ability to meet and use facilities. And we've seen it over and over again where this has actually been used against pro-life societies who are either already in existence or those applying. So lots of groups who have applied for new student union or student association status have been rejected based on these policies. So a free speech champion would certainly frown upon the overregulation of speech, and especially viewpoint discrimination.
So what do the student unions actually do, Roger? They try and say you can't be a member of the student union. Is that what they do? And are they?
Yeah, they usually say, we've passed this policy. You breach it, we can't affiliate you. Or right. You posted something. This goes against our policies. You have to remove it or face some kind of detriment. Right.
And they come to you, come to us, or the Free Speech Union. I know there's been some passing on from one to the other, and you tell them what the law says, and tell them to tell the student union what the law says, and they back down. Basically, that's what happens. Yeah.
So I mean, sometimes you have to threaten. We've had to go to court, and once those papers are filed and they speak to a lawyer and see the case against them, it typically gets settled pretty quickly. So yeah, we encourage any a free speech champion or not, we encourage any student association who's going through this to contact us or the Free Speech Union.
Yeah, great. And someone, is it Emma Garcia, is asking, are there any conservative universities in England? Emma?
The University of Buckingham has been quite good on that front. I'm not sure if you could describe them as a conservative university, but they certainly seem to be a home for dissident thinkers. And Oxford also has plenty of them, though obviously you wouldn't describe the university as a whole as being a conservative institution.
Well, Nigel Bigger is at Oxford, isn't he? He ran into a whole load of cancel culture type of trouble, didn't he, a couple of years ago?
Yeah, and that was for some research that he was just doing on the British Empire. So that is obviously a sensitive subject. But as Roger was saying about the subject of viewpoint discrimination, if you remember what happened last year with David Starkey at Cambridge University, and also before that when the psychologist Jordan Peterson was offered to have a visiting fellowship at the Faculty for Divinity, and that invitation was then dropped. And David Starkey's remarks, obviously, I'm not going to repeat them. But at the time, there was another professor, or she's now a professor, she was actually promoted after she made these remarks, who had made some pretty explicit remarks about white people, and I think most people would say explicitly racist remarks about white people, and had liked some tweets that usually, if that was on the other side of the ideological spectrum, that would have resulted in a whole hoo-ha, possibly firing, no platforming, like David Starkey, the stripping of titles. But obviously, I'm not suggesting that is what should have happened to her. I think everybody should be able to express their views, as you would expect. I'm a free speech sort of, I don't want to call myself a free speech extremist, but I think that people should be just able, especially in universities, to discuss.
Why is it important? Can you explain that? Because people sort of, if I play devil's advocate to you, okay, surely people who say things that might offend or upset other people, that's bad, right? You shouldn't just be allowed to upset and offend other people.
Yeah, so that's something that should be governed by manners and custom. So I don't think saying horrible things to other people or making racist remarks is morally good, but I think people should have the right to do it. I think people should have the right to, especially in universities, to be able to discuss controversial ideas, particularly in the current climate where particular viewpoints are unfairly maligned and result in people being, as Tim, very well, people who simply do research into Islamism being accused of Islamophobia, and that's a way to silence them. So I think it's especially important at universities because of the purpose of universities and the importance of universities to society, that people should be able to explore and discuss ideas without fear fear for their career or for their livelihoods. Because it creates intellectual conformity, and that's not good for society or for the universities or for the individual. It creates a sort of drift towards a sort of authoritarian repression of people's human rights, their right to a freedom of conscience, their right to freedom of expression or freedom of religion. So it's tied into so many things, and free speech is sort of the foundational right that all of the others are, in my opinion, pinned to. So that's why I think it's so important. But going back to Cambridge University, I think that was a really good example of the dynamic behind the viewpoint discrimination, where one professor can be promoted for making nasty comments about other people's race and skin color, and another who made similar comments is stripped of all of their titles, honours, fellowships of their long career, and obviously I'm not suggesting that anybody should be stripped of anything, but I think that does at least show the double standards or the hypocrisy that people perceive. And when people talk about the crisis of academic freedom or the crisis of free speech on campus, I think they're particularly thinking of how that is so unfairly applied, I think, is one way of putting it.
Yeah, yeah. Roger, what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would just add, to your comment, Tim, that there's such a cultural divide right now that 50%, around there of the population find the views of the other 50% offensive. So who do we censor then? Who do we say, which 50% do we say you can't say anything? You can't express your beliefs. That's why that doesn't work. And a second, relating to Emma's comments about, the racist promotion of racist views with regard to white people. That's why this has nothing to do with equality. We always say this is in the service of equality, but it's not. It's in the service of cultural Marxism, which says there are haves and have-nots, and we need to take away from the haves and give to the have-nots. So we need to be intellectually honest about what we're doing here when we allow speech against one group because of their skin color and say that it's completely forbidden in the other direction if we really want to promote genuine equality.
Mm-hmm. So, and the other area where free speech is sort of under attack outside academia, more generally perhaps, is the whole area of hate speech. And Emma's mentioned Harry Miller already, who famously got a knock on the door from a policeman. We need to check your thinking, when he hadn't actually committed any crime. He just tweeted some stuff. And the Law Commission has done recently a consultation on hate speech and proposed some shocking things, I think, really. And now also there's a hate crime bill going through Scotland with some quite alarming features. Roger, talk us through these issues.
Yeah, I think the Public Order Act already has some provisions for what is or could be deemed incitement to hatred. And they want to expand that. They think it's not enough. They want to expand the number of protected categories.
They want to about the Law Commission now.
Yeah, I mean, in both
Right.
the Law Commission and in Scotland. In
Right.
Scotland, they want to extend it to transphobic speech being hateful, and that it has a whole litany of problems because for the first time in history, we would have compelled speech. The damage that would do to freedom of conscience and freedom of religion and freedom of belief would be irreparable. That is thought control. When you say that you have to say certain things or you're forbidden from saying certain things, that banishes beliefs from the cultural landscape. So these provisions have a terrible chilling effect on any number of freedoms, not just freedom of speech.
Mm-hmm. Emma, tell us what you think is happening up in Scotland around there.
Well, so I think just on Roger's point there as well, that what worries me most about the compelled speech side of this is that there seems to be an overall shift, particularly in Scotland. It just seems to be dominant there for some reason, towards thinking that compelled speech particularly is acceptable. Whereas I think perhaps 10 years ago, people wouldn't have been so soft to the idea of it. And it reminds me of when Orwell described the meaning of newspeak. He spoke about it as the intention is to restrict the remit of thought so that a thought crime can't be committed. And this goes back to the cultural Marxism point, that it feels as though with the Law Commission and also with the hate crime bill in Scotland, that people are being herded into a very narrow intellectual confine, and that the law is being used as a tool to govern things that, as I mentioned before, should be the realm of culture and manners, and it just isn't something that is suitable for law. And that's what I think is particularly worrying about what we've seen in Scotland, and the process that the process for passing this bill in Scotland at the moment seems to be quite rushed. And campaigners have expressed, as you know, endless reams of concerns from journalists, from newspaper editors, from religious groups, from the church, every possible group, secularists and religious people alike, have expressed their concerns about this bill. And the Law Commission's proposals as well, both of them suggesting that, initially suggesting that it should also regulate speech behind closed doors. Feels as though it's trying to use
the Bible, isn't it? In Scotland, they said it could criminalise the Bible, even quoting the Bible, even owning the Bible potentially.
Yeah, it could lead to an endless slew of vexatious claims, like the Salem witch trials. Somebody's stolen your pig, and so you accuse them of being a witch. And I think that the consequences of this on free speech is so much more than just the letter of the law as we're seeing it, because as I mentioned with the unconscious bias training and also with Harry Miller's case, the having a little chat to discuss how you've thought wrong about something, you've had an incorrect idea, and therefore it needs to be talked through so that you learn to toe the party line accurately. I think that the consequences of that for people, not just in academia, but in society more broadly, because people do look to academia and see what's going on there. The consequence of that is what we saw in that Reclaim polling, that people don't feel safe to express their views. The polling showed that people felt safer to express their views at home, followed by in a restaurant or pub with their friends, and least of all in the workplace. And universities are both a workplace and a home for people. So I think that the psychological consequences of that for an entire generation of people going through universities, an ever increasing number of people going through universities, is resulting in a shift in our thinking about what is acceptable and what is not for the realm of law, but also with regards to compelled speech and to freedom of speech in general. I think people's trust in others in their community will be undermined if the government allows vexatious claims to be sort of weaponized to silence others' speech, and then you have institutions backing this up.
The problem with it is that hate speech is defined by perception, isn't it? If somebody perceives that it is hateful, then
that's exactly it. Is the subjectivity of it means that people are unsure about what they're actually allowed to say, and it shifts day by day. So people will just shut up entirely and stop thinking, and that's a very dangerous situation for society to be in, where people are afraid to think.
A hate incident is perception. So I could smile at someone across the street, and they could report it as a hate incident because they perceive it.
Or a third party could report you're smiling at someone else as being a hate incident.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So it's totally crazy, isn't
it? It creates a certain chaos and uncertainty in society that will. This is why it's most dangerous, I think, in universities, because it will stop people from thinking freely, because they'll be afraid to speak freely. Because if you're having wrong thoughts, then you might accidentally wrong speak, and that's a very dangerous situation to be in. And so I think that the broader climate that this is creating is a serious problem, which is why the government's proposals seeking to address this imbalance by institutionalizing and putting in legislation some protections to balance this and to give people a way to challenge the injustice of this climate that has built up, I think is just frankly one of the best things that the government has done in this government or previous governments have done in a decade.
What's shocking though is that the Law Commission thinks it would be a step forward to criminalise speech in your own home. I think they've backed down on that now, and the Scottish government thinks it's a step forward to do that as well, and to basically beef up these hate crime things. Roger, what's your thoughts on this?
I mean, it's terrifying to think folks who can barely run a government want to know what's going on inside of the privacy of your own home. That would never withstand the scrutiny of any international court, especially the European Court, which prizes the privacy of the homestead very highly. I don't know what the purpose of it is. Is it for dysfunctional families to call the police on each other? I mean, just talk about the.
Well, it could be. If we work on that, Roger, your kid could go to school, say that, my dad told me this, and suddenly, the teacher's reporting me for a hate crime for having said that some things are wrong or something.
Yeah, Solzhenitsyn wrote in the Gulag Archipelago, the way that prisoners were conditioned was that they weren't allowed to sleep with their hands underneath the blanket. If they can control you in the privacy of your own sleep and the privacy of your own home, they can control you, period. And this smacks of that in a sense. It's really government at its worst. It's Big Brother, quite literally.
Yeah, so, people will often make the sorry.
You carry on, Emma.
People will often make the overmade comparison to George Orwell's 1984 or to Maoist China. I've made the comparison to Maoist China before myself with the Cultural Revolution and all that entailed. But the shift in culture that we're seeing is something that it has all the hallmarks of any authoritarian regime. You could put a list of authoritarian regimes on a big piece of paper on the wall and throw a dart at it. And, any one of them, you would see this same shift in culture. And I think that's why free speech is the canary in the coal mine when it comes to the loss of other freedoms and the loss of our own autonomy. And even if you look at, for example, the recent Adam Curtis documentary series, this long 8-hour series that everybody's been watching, it's been very popular and is very disturbing. But he talks in that about individualism and liberalism and the questioning of that and chaos and so on. And it seems to tune in to a particular frequency in the zeitgeist, which is this eroding of the legitimacy of the individual and individual rights, and something that is very important in British law and in common law, the rights of the individual in relation to the law, and the people refer to it as being the ancient rights of an Englishman. Something that my parents' generation took for granted, and I see people who are younger than me don't seem to have those assumptions anymore. And I think that is very, very worrying, and we should view free speech as the canary in the coal mine on this.
Well, listen, I think we're running out of time, so it's just really time for closing comments. But listen, this free speech champion at universities is a step in the right direction. It's a bit of good news on this, and it's a step forward in terms of removing it. But also in the news, I've seen that it's been said that Home Secretary Priti Patel is thinking of cancelling hate speech laws, which would be a major step forward, wouldn't it, if that actually happened? Have you heard any more about that, Emma or Roger?
I'm not aware, but I think that would be a very welcome move, is my personal opinion on that.
Yeah, I would agree. I would note that when the issue of hate speech was, back in the day when they were debating the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, it was the now former Soviet Union, countries and the satellites, which desperately wanted in, and the UK was the one saying we can't have hate speech in the law. So it just shows how times have changed, and so I would certainly welcome the abolishment of hate speech as a concept in the UK.
Yeah, well, we pray and work and hope that is where things will go, and we're grateful for this step forward in terms of free speech at universities. Listen, thank you all very much for joining us. Thank you, Emma, especially. It's great to have you on the show today. Really appreciate you taking the time, and Roger as well. And thank you to those of you who've been watching us live or whether you've watched it on catch up. We'll look forward to seeing you again, same time, same place, next week on Round the Table. Thank you very much.